On one of those weekend hikes with friends, I'd heard about this Racing the Planet series of ultra races. Initially sounded like a crazy concept, but I thought, well, it would be a good challenge and a change to my daily working life.
Hello, intrepid listeners, and welcome to the Carpe Diem Live Your Dream podcast. Today's episode is about a pretty cool adventure race series called Racing the Planet. And our guest takes us to some amazing places like the Atacama Desert in Chile, the Gobi Desert in China, Antarctica, and other remote corners of the world. I'm your host, Dale Simonson, and I encourage you to check out our accompanying website, www.gocarpediemnow.com, for a bunch of related content. Enjoy the show. Hello, my guest today is Shane Noller. Shane is a Kiwi, from New Zealand. I know him from the 6 years that we worked together at PricewaterhouseCoopers when I was based in Hong Kong and he was working there as an expat from New Zealand. I mostly know him from our time in the office together. And I remember every year he would disappear for 2 weeks or so on some epic running race in some far corner of the world. I never really knew much about it, but he's run ultra distance races in so many incredible places. I just had to have him on the show. Shane, welcome to the podcast. So glad you could come join. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and these races that I'm referring to?
Sure. Thanks, Dale. And great to be here and great to reconnect after, I guess, 6 or 8 or maybe even more years that we worked together in Hong Kong.
Indeed. Yeah, 10 at least.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, so I lived in Hong Kong for almost 20 years through to about 2018. I worked mostly all in banking and then consulting for some of the major industry names. And prior to that, I'd been living and working in New Zealand and was originally transferred to Hong Kong with my job. And that's where you and I came across each other and worked together extensively. I guess in terms of my the adventure race activity, my career was pretty sort of fast paced and intense. And living in Hong Kong, which is a very intense environment, I was sort of looking for opportunities to do more sort of outdoor activity. And although most people think of Hong Kong as being a very sort of built up and commercial place, there is a lot of hiking, especially, and some great hiking trails in Hong Kong. And I was fortunate enough to have a lot of friends that organised weekend hikes. And so I was on one of those weekend hikes with friends. I'd heard about this Racing the Planet series of ultra races. Initially sounded like a crazy concept, but I thought, well, it would be a good challenge and a change to my daily working life.
I had only heard you mention Racing the Planet Desert Series back in the day when you were doing them. And I went to their site. They're still an active organization, and it sounds really cool.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a company called Racing the Planet, and they run a series called the Four Deserts. So each year they run a race basically in the Gobi Desert in the far west of China, the Atacama Desert in Chile. It used to be the Sahara, which they now operate in Namibia, and then the fourth race each year, or each second year, actually, in the case of Antarctica, is in Antarctica. So they're all pretty much the same
Wow.
format. 7 days, 250 kilometers, which is about 155 miles, I guess. And it's billed as a marathon a day for a week. So you
A
average,
marathon a day, a marathon a day for a week.
yeah. So you basically do sort of well, it depends how the individual race what they set, but it's approximately sort of 35 to 50 kilometers a day through the desert, cross country. Some of people may have heard of the Marathon des Sables in North Africa. It's a very similar concept to that. So you're self-supported. You need to carry your own food and clothing and equipment for that 7 days. And the organizers provide a place in a tent at the end of each day and water and some medical support should, unfortunately, you need it. But you really are, on your own. It's basically a stage race. So you set out each morning to follow a race or a route that the organizer has mapped out in a pretty remote place. And you go from checkpoint to checkpoint and then sort of come to the next camp sort of sometime at the end of the day.
And these are pretty remote locations, aren't they? Like you're really out there.
Yeah, well, that was one of the main appeals to me is you get to see some crazy remote places and very unspoilt and wild parts of the world, which normally people just don't see. So you see the landscape, you see the environment, you see some aspect of the culture because you're often passing through small villages or remote communities or farms of the local people. So it's definitely things that you don't see as a normal tourist.
Wow. And how many of these did you do?
I think I did 8 in total. Um, in
Oh,
addition to the 4 I mentioned, the Racing the Planet company usually organises a one-off each year as well. So I've done some of these one-offs in Iceland. They also did a separate one in Namibia at one stage a few years ago. Yeah, so it's some quite crazy locations.
huh. Well, when you say a marathon a day for a week, it sounds like it would just be intensely physical. But I'm really curious about the locations, just the environment in which you're running, the scenery. I mean, I've never been to any of those places you mentioned, but I got to believe the scenery is just amazing, like awe-inspiring, I would guess. Tell us what these places are like, or were you just heads down in the physical effort and you didn't even notice? Because that's what my wife would say that I wouldn't even notice what was around me. But yeah, tell us what it's like.
No, it's you can't help but notice the landscape in a lot of these places because it is just really so dramatic. In the Gobi in the far west of China, you do have what people think stereotypical deserts look like: mass, vast expanses of sand and dunes and not much else. But you also have incredibly dramatic mountains, grassland plains, pine forests, snowfields, river crossings. So even in that one location, it can be incredibly varied. And then, the other races, like obviously somewhere like Iceland is going to be a very dramatic landscape. Antarctica, uh, extremely dramatic, but also very different. So it's just enormously varied and always just so beautiful when you get to these crazy, remote, unspoilt places of very outstanding geography, if you like.
What revs me up the most are some of these natural sites, whether it's the Grand Canyon or Mount Fuji or whatever the natural, just those really epic, awe-inspiring sites. The earth is just so beautiful when you see places like that. So, which was your favorite? Did you have a favorite?
It's hard to tell. I guess Antarctica was pretty special, just because it's so unique and not many people get to go there, and such a extreme of conditions, of course. Iceland was also spectacular because, again, you sort of travel quite, or you're walking quite close to the volcanic and geothermal features that Iceland is so well known for.
Very cool. Did you have a least favorite course?
Probably the least favorite ones are the ones where there's just too much sand. I mean, sort of as probably most people know, trudging through soft sand is pretty tiring. And on some of the races where you spend many hours, if not days, just trudging through soft sand, that can be quite soul destroying. One of the big issues when you're in a lot of sand is keeping it out of your shoes because that can be extremely uncomfortable. And so you have to go to great lengths with gaiters and perhaps duct tape and all manner of mechanisms to make sure your shoes are sealed from sand.
Yeah, what's that Chinese proverb? It's not climbing the mountain that wears you down, it's the grain of sand in your shoe. Something like that.
Yeah, well, that makes sense because I think one of the key success factors of finishing one of these races is looking after your feet. And if your feet get
Yeah.
damaged or injured early in one of these events, it can become extremely painful. And a lot of people end up pulling out if they get their feet injured because it's just so painful and not feasible.
Yeah, I can imagine you're probably doing what, 60,000 plus steps a day, something like that.
Yeah, and they may have some of the photos on the website, but there's some pretty horrific feet injuries that occur just through
Let's
ill-fitting
not look.
shoes
Yeah,
or
let's
or
not look.
sand or mud or things like
Yeah, no, Shane, this podcast is supposed to inspire people
that.
to go do these things, not turn them away. Don't look, folks. Don't look at the website pictures. You mentioned that you were out on a hike in Hong Kong with some friends. Somebody mentioned this. Did you just like say, heck, I'm going to sign up, and you just signed up for your first Racing the Planet race. Tell me how that happened and what you were thinking when you did it.
Yeah, so one of my group of friends that I used to go sort of just easy Saturday afternoon hiking with in Hong Kong, she was working for Racing the Planet at one stage, and I'm not sure if she'd actually done one of the events, but she was certainly a big advocate of them. And I guess she sort of somewhat nagged me into looking at it more closely. And it was a little bit of a throwaway sort of comment or commitment, if you like. I said, oh, yeah, it sounds like something that, you know, it sounds like a challenge I should be looking for and stepping up to. And sort of, I guess, before I really realized what I was saying, I'd sort of committed to do it. Yeah, I mean, I really didn't fully understand what I was getting into. I think I'd signed up about, it wasn't a long time. I think it was about 4 months before the actual race. So a reasonable amount of time to try and get fit, but certainly not generous. And so I'd sort of perhaps slightly foolishly committed to doing it before I realized what was fully entailed.
Sometimes that's the best way to get into something is to don't think too hard about it, right? Just sign up and then you're sort of committed and just let it play out.
I think something in that, and if also even when you're doing the event, you can spend a lot of time thinking negative thoughts. Why did I do this? I'll never do this again. This is horrible. I just don't think there's any point thinking that, right? You've got to get to the camp at the end of the day. There's no point focused on, oh crikey, I shouldn't have done this, or this is really painful. I'm never doing this again. You just got to keep moving. What is that? I think Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. Don't stop.
Well, you clearly could not have had too many regrets after that first race because then you went on and did seven more.
Yeah, I suppose I did get sort of hooked. I think I did sort of one a year for the next 8 or 10 years. Yeah, but that was, I think, partly because they were just in such amazing places that I wanted to see. Sahara, wow, yeah, Namibia, wow. These are places that I probably wouldn't normally get to. Definitely wouldn't
Well,
normally get to.
you could have you could have done it in a dune buggy instead of on foot, I suppose.
No, you got to see it from the
But you
ground.
didn't.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be not the same experience, would it?
No, there's something special about being at ground level. And also, you do, a lot of places you run across some of the local farmers or villagers. I think you get a bit of feel for their lifestyle if you're walking over their property or walking past their house, however modest it may be, than if you're going through on a tour bus.
Oh, yeah. Well, dive a little deeper into one of these races. Tell us what the day to day is like.
Sure. So, as we talked about, they're in very remote places. So, for instance, maybe the first one in the Gobi Desert. So you generally sort of meet in a town with an airport a day or two before the race starts, and then you sort of spend perhaps one night in the nominated hotel to do your race gear check in, and so you have all your gear ready, and the organisers will check that you've got basically enough food to survive on for a week, and the mandatory safety equipment, and this includes things like a whistle, a mirror for attracting attention, a basic first aid kit, a safety blanket in case you get caught out in bad weather. And then, sort of on the day before the race, you load up into buses and get transported out to the first camp. And then you spend a night in camps in your allocated tent. And there's usually sort of 6 to 10 people in each tent. So you get to know your tent mates fairly well, and often sort of stay in contact and become friends with them. And then sort of the first day of the race, you sort of up early, have sort of the last of your reasonable sort of breakfasts before you're living on dried food for the next 7 days, and set off on the marked route. And they go sort of checkpoint to checkpoint. So there's every 12, 15 kilometers, the organizers will have a small tent, and they'll have water supplies, and there's a medic or two sort of roving around the checkpoints. And then you sort of follow the marked route. There's not really any navigation. They usually sort of mark the route out along animal tracks or backcountry roads or over mountain passes or whatever. And the organizers will sort of come through the route before the day before and put little flags out. So there's not a lot of danger of getting lost, although people do. And then really just
Mm.
sort of follow the route, get to the next camp, unpack one of your tasty dehydrated meals, and then usually people sort of check that their feet aren't blistering or don't have any hot spots, and try and sort of shake out the insects and dust from your shoes and your clothing, and unroll a sleeping bag and try and get some sleep on the hard ground in a tent with a lot of smelly snoring people, and then sort of repeat that for the rest of the week.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, and it's I mean the gear. Another key success factor is, I think I said shoes, but and foot care, but also the food, your your calorie intake for the week. Planning that is pretty important, because also remembering you are self-supported, so you're carrying all of your food and supplies for a week on your back.
Yeah.
And coffee. I think a lot of people take some sort of dehydrated or instant coffee so they can start the day on a bit of a buzz.
Or just a pinch of grounds between the cheek and gums. And are you running this, or is it a run walk kind of
Yeah,
thing?
it is. I mean, there's probably between 150 and 200 odd people do each event. Let's call it 200. Of those 200, there's probably only a dozen that would run pretty much all of it, or the vast majority of it. But the vast majority of people that do this are probably people a bit like you or me, sort of middle-aged people in corporate type jobs who want to get out and challenge themselves in some sort of physical adventure. People that just want to do something a bit different, really. And most of these people are run walk, or even just walk the whole thing. There's a big chunk of people that really just set out to finish it, and that's great.
Yeah, that's good to hear, actually. I like these kinds of events where it's not all just professional power athletes,
It's
racing
certainly not
against
that.
each other. Yeah, and yet it still must be pretty challenging physically. So, I mean, let's say a scale of 1 to 10 from a physical challenge standpoint, where would you put this? Because you can't just get up off eating potato chips on the couch for 6 months and go do one of these. But like you say, you don't have to be a professional athlete either. How
Yeah,
does it
no,
rank?
it's a bit hard to put it on a scale, I guess. I mean, you do see quite a number of um, strong marathon runners who attempt a four deserts race and fail, or cannot complete, or complete in perhaps a time much worse than they were expecting they would be able to do, because it's just a very different discipline. It's a very different physical outlay. Um, there's somebody in my tent a few years ago was a US Marine. Somebody that you would expect to be extremely fit and tough and in able to deal with extreme physical challenges and environments, but um, perhaps came into it with the wrong mindset, and started off too fast and didn't look after his feet, so had some bad blisters and things like that, and really couldn't sort of make it through the event. So it's very different sort of a physical uh, call on your body and your mind to most other sports that I can think of.
You mentioned the mental fortitude, or the Marine you would expect physically they would have no problem, and yet they do have problems. I think a lot of these endurance things are as much or maybe even more mental fortitude than physical. But tell me how you saw these events for yourself.
You certainly do need to have a pretty significant level of basic physical fitness. You need to have experience of long periods on your feet and long periods with weight, with a heavy backpack. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just sort of getting out there. And I think in some of the early days, I would train in Hong Kong, and I'd just go out each weekend and aim to spend 6 or 8 hours a day just on my feet with a heavy backpack. And I think I used to put bottles of water or even bags of rice in my backpack just to sort of load up the weight. So my shoulders, my body were getting used to having that weight on my back and spending time on my feet. And I think that's that sort of. I mean, I'm no sports scientist by any stretch, but I think that sort of setting your body up for what it's going to experience on an event is as important as the pure fitness, if that makes sense.
Hmm. And yet that's kind of focused on the physical fitness side of things. Did you ever feel like quitting mid-race on one of these? Did it take much of the mental stamina?
I think there was one time, it was maybe the second time I did the Gobi race in China, and we were crossing this sort of mountain pass, I guess, and it was quite a steep climb up. On the top of the mountain, a bit of a storm came in, and it was very wet and very cold, and the wind got up. And I sort of remember thinking, this is the coldest I've ever been, coldest and most unpleasant I've ever been in my life. And I'm going to pull out of the race when I get down to the bottom to the next race checkpoint, where there's going to be a camp stretcher that I can lie down, and somebody will have to ferry me back to the town. And then an hour later, I was at the bottom of the mountain, and the sun came out and dried my clothes. And I just thought, oh, this is not so bad. I'll carry on. So I think a lot of these things are temporary. And so I think you just sort
Yeah.
of, you just have to sort of say, oh, yeah, this is really uncomfortable, but in an hour or tomorrow or next week, I'll feel pretty good about getting through this and completing the race.
Was there something more that you feel like you got out of these? You mentioned you kept going back for the beautiful scenery, the environment, but you can get a lot of beautiful scenery much easier than doing what you did. Was there something more that drew you back?
It's a little bit of a sense of adventure, I guess. You sort of feel that you're in a very remote place, and even though there might be 100 or 200 other competitors with you on this particular event, by the middle of the day each day, you're quite well spread out, and you're often in a situation where you can may not even see any other competitors because everybody is sort of spread out. And it might sound a little bit antisocial, but then you sort of get back into the camp at the end of the night, into your tent, and you talking to your tent mates about what you saw and what you all experienced, and so it becomes a sort of quite a rewarding and congratulatory sort of an environment, I guess, for completing this physical challenge and seeing the country.
Yeah, I'm guessing there's quite a bit of camaraderie there with the participants. It's just fun, yeah?
Yeah, it is. It's fun.
I'm guessing these Racing the Planet races are on the expensive end of the range for ultra distance runs. I mean, just the cost of getting to some of these remote locations is probably well beyond many people's budgets. Tell us your thoughts on how others might be able to achieve essentially the same experience of this kind of adventure, but maybe in a more budget friendly way. You can certainly do it other ways too, right?
I think most countries have, networks of hiking trails that people can do, and they might be short hikes or long hikes or overnight or a week or more. And a lot of countries have, networks of backcountry huts or lodges or refugios, as they're called in the Alps. So there is ways of people to sort of cobble together their own version of their own individual version of a similar sort of a time in the countryside. And the racing the planet is one particular means to an end, but there's more informal ways of getting out there and experiencing these sort of things as well.
Well, there's one I can think of. It's not nearly like running across the Gobi. You and I were both in Hong Kong. There's at least their famous annual MacLehose Trail Run. I never did it. I wish I had, but that's super accessible for anybody in Hong Kong or planning to go to Hong Kong. It's for those who don't know, it's the longest, I think it's the longest trail in Hong Kong. What is it, 100 kilometers, Shane?
That's right. The McElhose is 100 kilometers. There is a longer one. There is a one that's 160. I think it's the Wilson Trail.
And the MacLehose, that race, well, I did the whole trail, but I did it in sections with my 8-year-old kids. Did you ever do that race?
Yeah, I did. I think I did it twice with different groups of friends. Great fun, super well organized, fantastic way to see Hong Kong. Pretty challenging physically because of the ups and downs, but yeah, quite easy in that it's well organized and accessible.
And then another example, I'm going to put a plug in here for you, Shane, because I just learned this about you. You're going to have to describe what you serve as. It's the Teararo. Okay.
Yeah, I'll pick it
I
up.
can't say it. Please say it slowly for us. Tell us
Sure.
about your role in New Zealand.
So there is a trail in New Zealand that goes right from the northern tip of New Zealand, Cape Reinga, it's known as, to the very southern tip of New Zealand. It's known as the Te Araroa Trail, which is Maori for a long pathway or long walkway. It's about a 3,000 kilometre route, so about 2,000 miles, I guess. And it's only really became established probably about 20 years ago and is gradually sort of ramping up in terms of popularity. It's fairly challenging in that it's pretty much cross country. There's a lot of beach walking. There's a lot of not bushwhacking, but a lot of sort of mountain walking through forests. It's pretty physically tough. A lot of challenging river crossings and things like that. And most people that set out to do the whole thing in 1 year wouldn't. They tend to do it over the summer, the southern summer. So people would generally start September-ish and finish in, say, April or May if they're taking their time. But that's to do the whole 3,000 kilometres. A lot of people just would do one provincial section. So they might just do sort of a week or two 1 year, and then on their next annual holiday the next year they might do another section and things like that. So yes, I'm the chair and trustee of one of the sections in the area where I live. In some ways, the trail's quite informal, and so my role as a trustee and chair is to try and develop the route and develop infrastructure. Trying to get basic campsites developed and negotiating land access, across private farmland and dealing with councils and Maori groups as the route crosses a lot of Maori land and so on. So yeah, I mean it's still fairly in some ways perhaps a fairly immature trail when compared to say the Appalachian Trail in the States or the Billman in Australia. But yeah, we're working to make it more accepted and more developed and more user friendly.
I'm so intrigued. I don't know when I'm going to get to New Zealand next, but when I do, I will have to make sure I do at least a section of that. So, Shane, what's your advice to people? Some helpful guidance, some motivation to give something like this a try. It doesn't have to be something as expensive as racing across the Gobi Desert, but at least start with something. What would be your advice?
I guess, a lot of people, most of us have busy lives, and it is quite a challenge to carve out some time to do something a bit physical. I guess my suggestion would be to just put on some comfortable shoes and just go for a walk. It doesn't have to be very long, but just maybe try and, if you don't do a lot of walking, do a walk. If you do already do some walking, do further and try a different route or an environment and just try and sort of build things up a little bit that way. There's no point making yourself too sore or too uncomfortable. It's more about small, continuous improvements.
Yeah, a little walk is certainly better than no walk. Well, it seems to me, Shane, like you really ought to do a through hike of the Tiararoa Trail. Did I say that right?
Pretty close. The Te Araroa Trail. Yeah, it's. I have toyed with the idea.
If I get there, I'm going to try part of it. All right. Well, Shane, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to hear your stories of the deserts.
Thank you, Dale. It's been fun revisiting some old memories of these events. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the Carpe Diem Live Your Dream podcast. If you like the show, there's nothing more valuable to me than you following it and sharing it with others. I drop a new episode every Friday, so tune in again for another great adventure story. And check out the accompanying website, www.gocarpediemnow.com, and then go seize the day and live your dream.